Good morning. Welcome to Fasken's 14th consecutive mining series. My name is Frank Mariage. I'm part of the Fasken Global Mining Group, and I'm also a partner from Fasken's Montreal office. Today's webinar, Indigenous Community Engagement in a Changing World, is the sixth in our series of 14 seminars this year. A calendar of all of Fasken's PDAC events can be found underneath the video window. Please refer to the slide on your screen for some housekeeping items. Now, I will turn it over to my colleague and partner, Peter Mantas, who is based in our London and Ottawa office. He's a litigation lawyer with a particular expertise in international mining disputes. He was one of the lead counsel in a recent settlement against the Canadian government involving the historic abuse of Indigenous children. The settlement at 23.5 billion Canadian dollars is the third largest litigation settlement in world history. Peter is the moderator for today's session, and I will let him introduce today's panel. Peter, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Frank, and welcome everybody. So, as you can see, you're here for the Indigenous Community Engagement in a Changing World panel, and we've got a great lineup for you today. Let me just introduce the topic, then I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then we're going to get into our speakers and hear from them. There's been a little bit of a change today, so I'll explain what's going on in a moment. But let me start by saying how mining companies can best engage with Indigenous community stakeholders. For those who are involved in the area, know that that is critical to success and becoming increasingly so. And the purpose of this seminar is to talk about how we can do better, how we can increase the chance of success, and how we can address emerging trends involving things like culture, ESG, climate change, and geopolitics. And what we've got for you today are three speakers who represent diverse perspectives. We have people from different parts of the world. Africa, Australia, Latin America, Canada, and the USA. We have Indigenous persons, one who owns a mining company, and one who leads a collective of Indigenous communities that addresses natural resource development. We have a lawyer who engages in these issues from the mining company side with a wealth of experience. We have a woman in an industry where female leaders, particularly of African origin, are almost unheard of. So I think we're going to be well served by the insights we're going to receive today. We're not going to be providing any presentations with a slide deck. Today is about having a conversation, having an open, free flow of ideas, and hopefully that'll give you an opportunity to learn. And you'll have a chance to ask questions as well. I've got some questions ready to go, but I encourage you to use our system to be able to send us some questions. So let me introduce the panel now. And I'm going to start with Chief Nkandu Beltz, who's not on the screen, and I'll explain in a moment why. But Chief Beltz, she's from Perth, Australia, and Zambia. She's a hereditary queen in Zambia. She's the first female owner of a mining company in Africa, Beltz Mining Limited, at least the first female owner that we're aware of. She's an author, a former journalist, a former politician, and a human rights activist. She has received awards for her approach to business, where she seeks to balance issues of sustainability, community engagement, and profitability. Good for business too. So Nkandu is actually at an airport right now in Australia. She's had an emergency that's come up that requires her to travel, and she has graciously joined us by phone as she waits to board a plane. And for that reason, you don't see her on the screen, and I'm going to ask her to, in a few minutes, Nkandu, do stand by, it'll be a few minutes, where I'm going to ask her to address us first, and then let her jump on her plane. The next person I'm going to introduce is, thank you, is Rafael Vergara, who is joining us from I believe he's in Santiago, Chile. That's where he resides. He is a partner and the co-head of natural resources and environment, the group at a firm called Carey, Abogados, which is one of the largest and most reputable firms in Latin America. Rafael has a wealth of experience in mining projects, in natural resources, and ESG. He has engaged with Indigenous communities on behalf of mining companies. We are well served by his knowledge and expertise today. He's studied law at the University of Chile and at Harvard, received many recognitions. The list is a long one. You can check his bio. He was recently Lawyer of the Year for mining by Who's Who Legal. But I will say the one thing, Rafael, that caught my attention in your bio, and I want to repeat it today, because we have some students on the line, I think, today, but in any event, he was elected the best undergraduate professor by the law school at the Universidad de Chile. And to me, that's impressive. When your students love you like that, that's great. And finally, and certainly not least, we are blessed to have with us Chief Sheldon Wuttunee, who is from Saskatchewan, Canada. He is the president and CEO of the Saskatchewan First Nations Natural Resource Center of Excellence, which I'm going to call the center after this. He is, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in a moment. He is a member of the Red Pheasant Cree First Nation in Saskatchewan, where he had previously served as chief. He has an education degree and has served as an educator and a principal, received numerous awards for teaching and social responsibility. With respect to the center and why I think we will be so well served by Sheldon today, it's a unique Canadian institution. It's wholly owned by the 74 First Nations in Saskatchewan. And their mandate is to support their participation in management and development of natural resources within treaty lands and traditional territories. And he's going to tell us a little bit about what they're doing, because I think it's important and we may see much more of it. He recently led a mission to the United States on the issue of Indigenous engagement in natural resource projects, which is our topic today. And that delegation was received by the White House and numerous federal departments and agencies. So we have an all-star panel on this topic, and we're happy to have you all here. Thank you. I'm going to now, given the sort of last-minute issue with Nkandu's schedule, I'm going to turn to Nkandu, ask her to speak to us for a bit, and then we'll let her go, and then we'll jump to more of an open panel discussion. So, Nkandu, can you hear us?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Perfect. So, Nkandu, my first question to you is for you to tell us about your own personal experience with Indigenous engagement.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be on the Zoom, as Peter mentioned. Before I answer that question, I just want to say that I'll be speaking from, as you mentioned, personal experiences. I am a traditional leader from Mantas, which is the northern part of Zambia, Luapula province, and I'm the queen of Chunda village, and it's also a very big mining district. And I live here in Perth, Western Australia, and lived in the Kimberley, which is also known for mining. So we like to say that we are in the mining capital of the world. So my experiences with Indigenous engagement in Australia, as well as in Zambia and Botswana, I can say there's been some positives, and then there's also been some negatives. And Peter, feel free to ask me further questions as I explain myself. What we are seeing now is that there have been some sort of improvements in terms of communication and collaboration, and then also seeing some Indigenous-led initiatives, not only here in Australia, but then also in Zambia. And for me, as a traditional custodian of the land, what we are increasingly seeing is that we having governments, for example, making it a priority that when mining companies come onto our land, even though they hold the mining license or exploration license, they have to consult with us. And these consultations are not just a courtesy call to say, here we are and here's a bag of mealie meal. We will go and do our thing. But what we're seeing is that as traditional owners, we want to have those meaningful conversations and consultations from the exploration all the way through to the land rehabilitation. I often say that we have been mining for hundreds of years before modern governments came in. So which means that we have our systems already set in place, and those systems are still embedded in our culture today. So it is very important that as mining companies are coming in, we continue to see the engagements, positive engagements with them. We've also seen the devastating impacts where, for example, historical sites have been disregarded and destroyed, and those are sacred grounds for us. So it is painful, and when such things happen, whether it's by accident, and these are accidents that can be avoided, it creates a distrust among us as traditional owners of the land. So we want multinationals to win. We want mining companies to win. I'm in mining myself, and I think with continued positive engagement, we can create a win-win scenario for both investors, vendors, and the local people.
Nkandu, you and I have spoken about some of your own personal experiences, and maybe you can share that with our audience. As a leader of a mining company and as a woman, and a woman of color in Zambia. Can you maybe share some of those experiences with us and tell us the challenges that you have faced?
Yes, I think some of the, being the first, I always say being the first is not enough, because we need more women who actually own mining projects, mining companies. So when you look at Zambia in particular, there's about 7% of the workforce in mining is actually women. And these are women driving trucks or, working as cooks and cleaners. So we don't have enough in executive positions. So we need to change that. And it's not that we don't have smart women that can actually occupy these seats. They are there, but it's about changing the narrative. And for me as a woman, one of the challenges that I faced, even like recently, I was at Indaba speaking, and a lot of people thought that I was actually a relationship manager or investors relationship manager for Beltz Mining. So everyone was asking, a lot of people were asking as to who is the man behind this company. And I think we need to change that narrative, because at the end of the day, mining is a business, and as like any other business can be run by woman or man or, any gender. So I think there's need for a lot of awareness and understanding, and also asking, why are we doing what we do?
And I think even within Zambia, in your own country, you've had issues where you've been engaged in exploration projects and or an exploration project, and the local authorities have had difficulties believing that you would be the head of such a company, especially with mining engineers around you who are male
Absolutely.
and non-African.
Absolutely, yes. I was almost arrested. We were doing exploration in a little corner of Zambia, and I had what I can say majority Caucasian team. And when we arrived in that little village, 4 hours after arriving, we were summoned to go to the police station. And one of the questions that the police asked us was what we were here to do. So I mentioned to say that we're here to do exploration. This is who we are. And I am the managing director and founder of Beltz Mining Limited. And so they asked, and the question was, who are these white people? How do you have white people working for you? It's supposed to be the other way around. So, and I did mention that, a lot of our team are qualified, geophysicists and geologists, and we also have a local workforce. But it was very hard for them to actually believe me, so that it turned out for 4 solid days we're being interrogated, and one of the local chiefs had to jump in, and I had to call one of my uncles to intervene. But it is very hard for them to actually see a woman in this position, and it's not only in Zambia. It also happens here in Australia. It also happens in South Africa. So what that has taught me is that sometimes I have to take a step back, because even when we were initially starting our project, we were doing a geochem, and we were walking 17 kilometers a day. And some of my team members that we had employed, the local workforce, would constantly ask me, when is the boss coming? And so, 10 days into it, I got tired, and I just said, look, the boss will be coming probably next week. So I kept on saying next week, until we finished doing our geochem. So it is quite a challenge, but the reason why I do what I do is to create employment for our people. And then at the end of the day, it is a business, and we also have to make profit and make sure that, we do this in the most sustainable way. I come from the copper belt of Zambia, and we have seen the devastating impact where there's been class action, because, there's been a lot of contamination and pollution, and thousands of people have died due to that. So the reason why I'm in this is also to make sure that, we can avoid such negative impact on our people, be it in Zambia, in Australia, or anywhere where we operate.
Yeah, and Nkandu, I'm going to ask you one final question. Let's assume I am heading up a mining company, and I am going into Africa or Australia, and I'm curious to get your perspective on both, entering into a project which finds itself on traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. What would be your advice as to, how a company can approach the community in a respectful and appropriate manner, so as to properly get them engaged, get them on side, in other words, and as sort of a supplemental angle to this, how do you deal with opposition and conflict that may arise in that relationship? Any tips you can give us from your perspective in both these regions?
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's a very important question. It's probably one of my favorites. So I will answer it in 2 parts. So one, the first tip I would say is get to know the custodians of the land, get to know the gatekeepers, have a proper understanding and a history. And then once you get to know who they are, what their values are, what they stand for, and then government engagement also comes in. Usually the government will also have some guidelines on how you could go about it. So for example, let's start here in Australia. I lived in Indigenous communities in Kununurra. There is a wealth of knowledge among our First Nations people here. And when companies come in, it's just a matter of sitting down and explaining who you are and creating that bond, and also seeing if there's anybody in that community that can add value to what you are doing. And it is the same with Zambia. So, for example, in our chiefdom, where my uncle is. He's the senior chief, Uncle Peter. There's been companies that have got exploration rights for copper, and because they haven't paid, the courtesy call just to go and say who they are, and they send their geologists in. So Uncle Peter has got every right to say, you are not welcome on this land. And that can hinder progress, and we don't want to hinder progress. So it is just respect and common sense that companies go in, have a sit down, and then seeing how the values are aligned with those of the local people. Like I said earlier, we've been mining for hundreds of years. So there's already a fair bit of knowledge that the locals can add to what you're doing, and also with modern technologies and education. And then the second question on resistance, this comes to not having our values aligned. So we've seen it as well, both here in Australia and in Africa, where companies go in and they think they know what's best for the locals. And and then there'll be resistance from the locals to continue exploring or mining in that particular area. And then, of course, you've got activists who will try by all means to stop progress, but usually they will be on their mobile phones and they will come by train or by car. So I always say that if anybody is opposing mining, they shouldn't even live in a forest, because they will still need some sort of mining activity for them to actually be able to live. And like we say, the Stone Age did not end because people ran out of stones. We innovated. So it's how do we innovate and move forward as a people.
Okay. Well, Nkandu, thank you so much for the time you've given us today. You're certainly free to stay on the line. I'm going, but if we wish you a safe flight, and I'm going to turn to my other panelists now, and we'll move from here. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My flight is 15 minutes to the airport, and then it's about an hour. So thank you so much, everyone, and I'm sorry I could not be there.
Great. Sheldon, I want to pick up the conversation, the thread with you, because, and then I'll move to Rafael. I want to stick to this question about, sort of how to deal with the community, how to approach it, and then how to deal with conflict. And then, I'm going to ask Rafael the same thing so we can get differing perspectives. But why don't you, if you can, pick it up for us? I'm a mining company, and I've just decided I want to engage in a project in could be Saskatchewan, it could be in Canada, and I want to do the right thing. Well, for the time being, we'll assume that you've got a progressive company that wants to actually do the right thing. How do you approach it? I mean, there's not rule books written on showing respect and common sense. Hopefully people have got that figured out, but maybe easier said than done. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your perspective, tips you can give us and from what you've seen.
Yeah, well, first I'd like to say thank you and good morning to everybody that's here and online and Nkandu. I do want to thank you for taking the time to be on with us, and hopefully at some point in the future we'll get to meet in person. Your story is absolutely fascinating, and want to commend you on your great work and experience through the years. And I think it's a great aspect of role modeling for women. And I think as people that are involved in the natural resource and development sector, you are very right. It's extremely important that we do make room for women to take on leadership roles, within our organizations, within our companies, and moving to that aspect of ownership is certainly where many of our women aspire to be. So I want to commend you again on your great work. And just moving along and picking up on some of the points. I too have had a number of years of experience as chief of my community in Red Pheasant, and have been, on the leadership side and on the nation side in terms of dealing with natural resource projects. And now into my role with the center. And I find myself in a fortunate situation in many respects because I get to learn from our many nations, our elders, our leadership right across Saskatchewan, and what are the good things that they feel are happening, and maybe some of the not so good processes or initiatives that are being undertaken. And so, as we move into, I'll say more recent era around Indigenous engagement. I always preface many of my sharings around as Nkandu mentioned, you have to be at the level of the community. And I come from an area in Saskatchewan. We're covered by a number of treaties with the Crown, and I'm from Treaty 6 specifically. And I think within our jurisdictions, within Canada, with respect to First Nations, I think there's a number of issues that we need to pay attention to and be mindful of. And some of those are with respect to reserve lands, specific reserve lands for First Nation relative to the Indian Act, and then we need to pay mindful attention to inherent in treaty rights. And, as I mentioned, most of central Canada are covered by a number of treaties. And so there's responsibilities within that as well. And then we also need to be mindful of traditional areas. And that is much more broad than a First Nations reserve. It's much more broad than a treaty area, in different areas or regions where our people have practiced or have, carried out their inherent rights for generations before us. And so the landscape when we're looking at Indigenous engagement can be quite broad. And it's important for companies and governments to really educate themselves in terms of who do we talk to. In most jurisdictions now, there are duty to consult policies. But, I think that we find as First Nations people, especially on the prairies, and in my experience, that the duty to consult policies with the provinces or the federal government, for that matter, don't go far enough to respect what our needs and our requirements are as First Nations. And so as a company, seeking, opportunity in a jurisdiction, like ours in Saskatchewan, I would recommend and encourage that, you go further than what maybe the consultation policy guides you to. And, as in our First Nations communities now, we've built up, quite a bit of capacity. And not necessarily full capacity in the mining sector, but I think capacity to meet at the table and being able to convey what our needs and what our requirements are as First Nations people here in the prairies. And it's I'm in Ottawa this week attending the Canadian Nuclear Association 2024 conference, and I was discussing with one of our nations, English River First Nation, last night. We had some supper, and they've just recently signed an agreement with a company, Denison Mines here in Saskatchewan. And so we talked about their process in terms of the good work that they've done. And as a company entering a new area to potentially explore or build those relationships, it's very important that you are ready to have those difficult conversations. and be able to learn to some extent, being able to integrate into the community or into the nation, because there is a profound spiritual context to the relationship that often gets missed. And with respect to who we are as First Nations people and our, natural laws, if you will, and those responsibilities to those natural laws, to Mother Earth, to the Creator, to our spiritual connections to our plants and medicines and animals and so forth. Those are always at the forefront. And when we look at our treaty rights in Canada, they're generally the general consensus, I guess, in society is the treaty rights are to hunt, fish, trap, and gather, and that is correct. But there's other components of it in terms of a spiritual context, and as we would talk to more around inherent rights and that ability to continue to practice our spiritual ways of life in a clean area. So obviously in saying that, when we're looking at natural resource development, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's mining, those are all going to have impacts to our traditional and cultural ways of life. And so for you as companies, as folks that are in government, it's extremely important that those understandings do occur. And again, and just coming back to the experience with English River, how as a company are you going to move the community from saying no? What does that mean? And so the only way you're going to get to know that, again, is to be able to develop that strong relationship with the community and to better understand what the needs are. And then I think at some point, once there's conversations and better understanding on environmental impacts, spiritual impacts, and so forth, then perhaps there's an opportunity to start to talk about the economic opportunities associated with the project. And our nations in Saskatchewan, they're are moving more towards as Nkandu mentioned, not so much in work opportunities and procurement opportunities and those opportunities through the value chain, but what does equity look like? What does revenue sharing look like associated with the project? So it's good to see, in recent days that all of these types of opportunities are on the table, where now we're becoming owners of projects, because ownership will drive procurement. It'll drive added responsibility as well, and it'll drive a heightened notion of accountability to those Indigenous people that you're operating within their lands. And so I'll maybe leave my comments there, Peter, with more to share, as the webinar goes on. So thank you.
Thanks, Sheldon, for those comments. Rafael, let me turn to you. And I want to pick up on something that Sheldon said. You can then broaden it up a bit more. But he said, how do you move a community from no, which I think is a big issue for companies. Perhaps it's when in dealing with Indigenous communities, to the extent that there's a problem, that's probably the biggest issue. If you can, talk to us a little bit about your experience and your perspective on that fundamental question, getting communities to be, supportive of what's going on, as opposed to not wanting to do it or opposing it in some manner.
As my colleagues, thank you, Peter, for being part of this panel, and thank you for sharing. And for me, it's an honor to share this panel with Sheldon, with Nkandu, and I have to learn a lot from you guys, and I really appreciate the chance to share some, this panel with you, and thanks to the audience to be today in this seminar. So what I have experienced, is that sometimes or many times the indigenous communities do not know how the mining project can be or can affect them. So the first issue here is to approach to the communities to know what are their concerns with respect to the mining projects. Because unfortunately, we have not received good publicity, I would say, with respect to the mining projects in general. We are, eating the nature or destroying the nature, and therefore, the indigenous communities that feel quite close to the lands and to the areas that the project can be developed or in the future can feel, from the very beginning that they will be affected by the mining project, and they will, the mining project will destroy what for them and for the ancestors, was and has been respectful and valued. So in that sense, probably the first item to have in mind here is to know who are the communities, where are the communities, the indigenous people, the nations, what is the relationship of the community with respect to the land that you will use as part of your project? How the project can affect, the community's lands or the lands that the communities has felt is part of their culture, of their, assets. And based on that, the second issue is to approach to the communities and to know what they feel or what they see, what they know about the mining projects. And what I have seen in the past is that you have to be a sort of teacher, of the communities in the sense that you will have to explain them what is first of all, what is the sequence of a mining project, and how the mining companies face the relationship with the lands and probably with that, you will have a certain percentage of people already on board in terms of they accept the possibility of having a mining project. The third issue probably here is to deal directly with them, in terms of what are their concerns. If they know the project, if they know what we will do, what they will do or what their concerns, with respect to how to manage the land, how often we will go through this area or how we will use, and of course to discuss a sort of mitigation measures, compensation measures, but again, depending on the importance and the value that they have with respect to the specific components of the area that the project will be built. So in general terms, what I have seen, is that at the end of the day, they accepted the project, and they, even more, Peter, I would say, if you can convert the indigenous communities as a kind of allies, supporters of your project. The social license that we have here, in the past is critical for a mining project. 10 years ago or 20 years ago, the paradigm was not exactly that, but today the social license, and part of the social license is to have the communities around the project or, nearby supportive of your project. And therefore, you have to deal with that, you have to discuss, and as early as possible, in my view, and create places of communication. I mean, constant, permanent communication. You have to go there. You have to meet there. Maybe to have what we call here working tables. Every bi-weekly or once a month or whatever, have open discussions with the people. And finally, is in my view, is quite critical to know exactly not only the communities, and I pick up some of what Sheldon was saying, is not only know the communities, but also, the leaders. It's critical to know exactly who are the leaders and to convince the leader, to transmit these ideas or the knowledge about the project to the communities themselves. It's not enough to have a relationship with the leaders. You have to get, at some point, the convincement that that the messages that you are sending through the leaders, those messages are arriving properly to the people, to the members of the communities. Because in some communities, the leaderships are disputed sometimes, and you have to be very careful with that, So those are the issues that I would raise by now, Peter, with respect to the cases where you have an opposition from the communities.
Thank you, Rafael. Sheldon, I'm going to ask you a difficult question, which is picking up a little bit on what Rafael just concluded. How do you deal with the situation where there is internal disagreement within the community, where perhaps some leaders are not aligned with other leaders, perhaps from different communities, or perhaps the leadership has opposition within his or her own community? And in particular, what advice can you give mining companies who are on the outside looking in, might want to just do the right thing, and they're just not sure what to do now in terms of addressing that kind of discord, if I can call it? What's your perspective on all of this?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, I was thinking about it, and actually your question led right into some of my thinking and a response. But I want to thank you, Rafael, for your comments, because that does happen often. I will kind of back up a bit, and just in terms of leadership on reserve within our nations, and on a lot of fronts, the Indian Act dictates, a large portion of the governance, from a jurisdictional perspective, with relative to Canadian jurisdiction. But there's obviously traditional and cultural jurisdiction as well that becomes associated with projects, and we have our I mentioned earlier, natural laws and cultural laws and cultural protocols that we all need to adhere to. And one of the things that I really like to share, because Indigenous engagement and where we've been and where we're going, and really leaning on the notion of reconciliation, and what does that mean? How do we move along with this notion of reconciliation? How do we incorporate the United Nations Declaration? We're moving towards some legislative processes now within Canada. But I always go back to a simple teaching. And for First Nations people, we base our decisions, on our relationship with the Creator and Mother Earth. And our first act of reconciliation for First Nations, leadership and people is that reconciliation with the Creator. And I want to share a little bit about that, because when leadership is entertained with an opportunity around mining, we often turn to ceremony to help guide us, and that is to ensure that we are conscious of that, and we're making our initial offering to the Creator to help guide us in making good decisions for the future generations of our people. And I think that's a really important fundamental teaching, because as mining companies and governments, further communicate and become involved with First Nations as it relates to resource development, that's a very important teaching. And so as you go into community or you go into a nation, that is extremely fundamental to understand that it's not only an economic opportunity, it's not only a geophysical or geotechnical work. There's a whole spiritual component. So I really want to drive that forward. And I think as we start to look at economic opportunities, as we start to look at potential impacts or geotechnical information that's being shared with the community, I want to strongly encourage mining companies that are looking at operating in on or near a First Nation or Indigenous community to ensure that you equip the community with what they need to understand solely as the community, not necessarily with the mining company in the room. And, I mentioned a bit earlier around duty to consult processes within the respective provinces here in Canada. I will say that in our experience that funding envelopes and initiatives within our respective provinces don't do enough for First Nations or Indigenous people to effectively understand, as you mentioned, Rafael, what those impacts can or may be. They don't necessarily understand what the economic impacts or opportunities may be as well. So investment in that upfront from the mining company to ensure that, as you mentioned, Rafael, to understand what the concerns are, and a little further to understand what the upfront needs are, and fund that, because that way the nation or the community can do their own due diligence on their own. They can bring in technical experts that they trust. Just you want to be honest that history hasn't presented itself in a trustworthy manner to us as Indigenous people. And so when mining companies do come into our area or regions, that trust needs to be developed. But we see a lot of investment being made, not necessarily directly with us as First Nations, to ensure that we fully understand a project and are able to make informed decisions. We're often rushed. Then we have to rush the community, or we have to rush our band membership. We have to rush our cultural leaders. And so we kind of get put into a position where we're in a responsive process due to timelines that are imposed, on our communities. So not that, work can't be carried out, in a short period of time, but when you call on First Nations leadership within a community to start imposing timelines on band membership, that we have to make a decision by, at 30 days, or we have to respond in 30 days, those types of things, that becomes really difficult, because as leadership in First Nations, it's very important that consultation and that feedback and the ceremonies, that all takes place with the community, because these projects they're huge, and they're multi-billion-dollar projects when it comes to mining. And within our treaty teachings, from our elders, it's fully understood, across Canada, that via treaty, we as First Nations only agreed to share our lands to the depth of a plow in terms of agriculture. So the whole resource base that's beneath the depth of a plow is still ours in essence. But now we have competing federal and provincial jurisdictions within our own inherent natural law and treaty understanding. So all of those types of things all come into play when we're entertaining a project within our respective treaty or traditional areas. So I think that, you know, my final point on this is that as a mining company, you need to ensure that you do your due diligence in understanding the First Nation or Indigenous people's way of life and their worldview, and ensuring that you're equipping them financially to have independent technical experts that they can work with. And oftentimes, you know, we'll have band meetings or you know, we'll have gatherings, and so that allows those individuals or those families perhaps within our communities to be able to come and be a part of the conversation and understand that, as opposed to having, you know, a band meeting and there hasn't really been much information, and there's a faction of people that are against it, a faction that's for, and then you have that play out, you know, in front of the potential, you know, mining company or corporate partner, and that doesn't bode well for anybody. So I think that, you know, providing the capacity to the nation to undertake their own due diligence on their own time very early in you know, in the project, you know, project development, I think that's extremely important. And I think on that point, Peter, that's what I would share today. And as I mentioned earlier in my comments, that many of our nations now are becoming very adept and knowledgeable in the natural resource sector. You know, my role at the center is to ensure that no chief or no nation is left behind. That when a company is approaching a nation, if they don't have the capacity, then it's my job to come and ensure that the nation has capacity and support. And because the technical information can get pretty overwhelming pretty quick, and for a chief and council, or you know, to fully understand that and make decisions and work with the nation members, it gets very difficult. So that capacity needs to be there to support their work. I'll leave my comments there, Peter. Thank you.
Rafael, I want to continue something that Sheldon talked about, and that's this issue of ceremony, which I'm curious in your part of the world to understand how it's dealt with, and how, you know, how mining companies interact with that. And by that, I'm talking about traditional ceremonies. I've come to learn in my own experience, and you've heard it from Sheldon, that it is very important among most Canadian, if not all Canadian Indigenous communities, some, you know, engagement with people outside of the community in some form of traditional ceremony that reflects their own culture, and that can be, you know, part of negotiations, can be part of discussions, can be part of all sorts of things like conflict resolution. You know, people from outside the community come to learn about traditions from the Indigenous community and people there, both elders and others. I'm curious about whether that also happens in Latin America, whether you've seen that in your experience. And while you've got the floor, I'm also curious to hear from you whether or not in your conversations with clients and mining companies, whether there's a reflection on whether experts should be sought on engaging with Indigenous communities, or perhaps, you know, the better way to do it is, you know, following up on something you said, just simply having the people at the mining company getting out there and speaking to the locals and learning, but maybe getting it wrong, you know, maybe saying something that they thought they were saying the right thing, but they didn't. So I just want to get your perspective regionally, and also with dealing with, you know, mining companies.
yeah, first of all, I would like to fully support what Sheldon was saying, regarding the approach to the communities in terms of knowing their seeing what has happened with the indigenous communities 10 years ago or 15 years ago. It was not possible to imagine that the companies could give some support in terms of technical people, advisors, qualified to give advice to the communities, And let me tell you that it's the best deal that you can do in terms of trying to have everybody in the same line, in the same place, in the same surface. And that is something that the companies has learned, I would say, in the last few years, and that is related to what you were asking for, Peter. In Latin America, no doubt that today the companies that want to be successful in terms of the approach to the land, and to the people in the land, either indigenous or not, they have to learn about what the people do in the land, what are their beliefs, what are their ceremonies, what are their relationship with the land. Sometimes what I have here, for example, with respect to the land, in the view of the indigenous people, is that the land is a live body. I mean, it's a sort of live body, and therefore we have to respect that live body. And part of the live body is the ceremonies that you have to do, or that you have to, deal or make with respect to the land. And in Latin America, you can see, a lot of that in terms of the relationship with the Pachamama. The Pachamama is the the nature, is the mother nature, and the relationship with them through ceremonies that every single year that you have to carry out, and you have to feel very honored if in some point you are invited to these ceremonies, and the companies, what I have seen, there are some companies that prefer to have their own people that go to the ceremonies and that have the relationship with the communities, and sometimes there are some other companies that prefer to have experts, or people who lead, who deal with the indigenous communities in a permanent way. So yeah, I don't have a preference, except for one thing, the people who is in charge of the relationship with the communities has to behave as a very respectful people with respect to the communities. You have to behave as somebody who really, maybe you don't share their views, that you respect them, but really the body language has to show that stuff. And sometimes there are some companies that do not have the appropriate people in that sense, and sometimes they do have. I have clients that they have somebody in charge of the matter, and really feels cry for the same stuff that indigenous people have. And it's wonderful, because the relationship that you create is great, and and the most of what can happen with the mining with the communities with respect to the mining project is to sort out the problems is the relationship that you create, and based on the relationship you are able to solve the issues that every single project, mining, either energy or whatever, face daily in daily basis. You can face problems, you can face accidents, and to the extent that you have that permanent, relationship and I would say honest transparency. I would say consistency. Your behavior should be consistent with what you say. At the time that you moving that in one way and you say something in the other way, people lose trust, and you have to create trust with the communities. This is a long period work, long time work, but anyway, it's wonderful because at the end of the day, again, it's an opportunity to create allies, to give what I have believed all my life. The mining industry create opportunities, create value, give the people another quality of life, and therefore you can give, respecting the culture of the First Nations, opportunities in that sense, and I believe that it is perfectly possible,
Thank you. I just want to take a moment before I ask my next question to Sheldon to just remind people that there is an opportunity for you to send questions through the Q&A system we've got set up. I've got a few questions. I'm going to try to get to them soon, but we welcome questions and your engagement. Sheldon, change is part of the topic of this panel today. I think we've heard from both you and Rafael, and in fact, Nkandu beforehand, about how things have changed a lot in the last 10 years. And I think anybody who's engaged in this industry knows that there has been a significant change in terms of how things are, the interaction between mining companies and Indigenous communities. And I'm looking for you to comment on a couple of things for me. One is to tell me a little bit about what kind of change you've seen. But there's another question that I'd like you to help me with, because it's one that I don't think has an easy answer, and it's why. Why now? What has happened in the last 10 years, perhaps a little bit more, to create this change that we're now seeing? So I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you for that, and Rafael, again, thank you for your comments there. It's a good feeling knowing that there are similar understandings and ways of interacting in other parts of the world, which I think is very comforting. And Peter, to your question in terms of some of the changes over the last 10 or 15 years, and I know in terms of my role in building relationships and my position at the center in working on behalf of 74 First Nations, looking to how do we create understandings? How do I educate, and how do I educate government and industry on concerns and issues and opportunities, but also how do I help educate our people, our leadership, or people at the band level? And once upon a time, when I was a chief and leader at Red Pheasant, there was one of the Enbridge pipelines were coming through Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and at that point in time, as chief of Red Pheasant, I felt that our rights weren't respected, that the trust wasn't there, that we had entered into some conversations and it didn't necessarily pan out as to what we agreed to. And so at that point in time, I and other chiefs across Saskatchewan were involved in a blockade, in terms of that pipeline development, to not let it move ahead until our rights were properly respected, or we felt they were respected. And so it's when I think back to those days in 2008 and to today, and seeing the change in coming to the table, in seeing the change in deeper understandings, and if you get to a more practical level, ensuring that policies within corporations, that those developing policies within corporations with respect to Indigenous inclusion, Indigenous or First Nations equity opportunities, that those, as Rafael said, that those are practiced. They're not just said, but actions speak louder than words. And I think that's one thing that I've seen over the past number of years, is that there's definitely more attention being paid to the relationships with First Nations and Indigenous people, and more opportunities. I think there's greater understanding, in the corporate sector, for who we are and what our rights are. I think specifically to our situation in Canada, not, and understanding that it did happen in other parts of the world, but, the coming forward of our elders and our people that attended residential school, it's had a profound effect on how Canada, how the provinces, and how corporate Canada interacts now and gains a deeper understanding of what we've been through as Indigenous or First Nations people, and a better understanding that it has to change as things move forward. We've given up a lot over the years. We've gone through quite an oppressive history here in Canada, and how do we make that right moving forward? Within Canada here as well, the adoption of the United Nations legislation, that's a big step forward. Not that we fully figured that out yet, but that's a big step forward. Recognizing that, First Nations do have inherent rights that existed prior to treaties. And we have natural laws that guide those rights and guide our protocols. And so those types of things that, I've seen definitely over the past 10, 15 years, Peter, in terms of, what things have changed. You look at today, I think, more definitive, specific procurement policies, if we get a little more practical, those things are all good opportunities to enhance our involvement in different sectors from a business perspective. Again, I'll reiterate, equity, ESG, notions of ESG now that are coming into play. I think there's more work to do in terms of First Nations or Indigenous involvement and interaction in the investment community. When it comes to mining projects and reporting to the investment community, I think there needs to be more oversight for us as First Nations in terms of what the relationships have been and how that's communicated out into the financial or investment community. In terms of the why, again, I'll go back because I really want to pay homage to those elders and people, again, that have attended residential schools, because they went through a lot, and our families have gone through a lot, and my family is one of those families that didn't necessarily have a good last 40 years, because effects of residential school, and that's real life stuff. And I think that by that coming out into the public eye, and the public becoming having more insight on what we've been through, and understanding that it's not necessarily always us against them. We need to work in partnership. We need to collaborate. We have treaties across Canada that agree to share the lands. And how do we find those mechanisms where legislation, regulations, policy, and jurisdictions aren't oppressive to First Nations people, that they're actually uplifting and empowering? I think those are really important components. I think we're on that trend. We see a lot more, probably integration isn't the right word, because we went through a period in the 60s of integration. That's it's not always a fond term to use, but I think in a certain sense as well, as Nkandu mentioned earlier, how do we uplift our people? How do we uplift our women, our First Nations people, to become executives in companies? And how do we uplift our people to own companies alongside non-Indigenous or non-First Nations people? How do we work together to build that relationship? And I think that's the continuum we're on. As you mentioned, Peter, things have definitely changed, in my time here at CNA and other interactions I have with government and in the business community. The dialogue is much different. And I don't think that I hope that we don't find ourselves back in having to blockade or protest a project, that the learnings and understandings and capacity can be provided to our First Nations. And I'll go back to Nkandu's earlier comment as well around sacred areas and sacred sites. And I think as mining companies, as industry or government do become more knowledgeable and gain a deeper understanding with us as First Nations, there's specific reasons why some areas, geographical areas are they're no-go zones, because of those spiritual ties and those sacred connections to those areas. And that's an important understanding that needs to be learned by government industry, but that won't occur unless that relationship prospers with First Nations or Indigenous people. I think in terms of that as well. Before I forget, as mining companies, begin to interact with First Nations or Indigenous people, always ensure that that you're meeting at the appropriate level. And by that I mean, if you're looking to have a meeting with the chief of a nation or council of a nation, it's important that your CEO interacts directly with the chief, or the board chair, of the shareholders, have that interaction and that relationship with the chief as well. And so, because what happens, as you mentioned, Rafael, sometimes the companies may, they'll handpick a person or a group of people that may be Indigenous, maybe not, and to do that, to build that relationship with the nations, but they're not necessarily at the executive or leadership level that a First Nation leader would expect them to be. So I think that's an important piece. I think that needs to occur full stop in every relationship. I think that things will move along much better when that appropriate respect, as you mentioned, is paid to those that are in leadership within our First Nations as well. Well, I'll leave my comments there, Peter. But I appreciate the question.
For those of you on the line who may not be from Canada or perhaps don't follow a lot of the Canadian news, when Sheldon spoke about the residential schools, he was speaking about a very sad aspect of Canadian history where young Indigenous children were forcefully placed into schools and removed from their culture and their families. And that's caused significant trauma, intergenerational trauma. And, I won't get into a lengthy talk about it, but it has, I think, not only shocked and distressed a community, but I think, Sheldon, I'm hearing that it also had some, from your perspective, an element of shock and a reevaluation among non-Indigenous peoples in this country, which may have had an impact in how communities and Indigenous communities in particular are viewed and treated. So perhaps out of something awful, there may be some good that has come out of it. At least we can hope. But Rafael, turning to you, in a country that has not had necessarily that experience, there's been awful things that have happened among Indigenous communities in Latin America. And I would, so perhaps the history is different though. And I'm curious to hear from your perspective, are we seeing, I think you've said we're seeing change. Why are we seeing that change? And perhaps on a less positive note, I think we know that the change has not always been positive over the last few years in certain parts of Latin America. For example, in Brazil, under the prior government, there were things that were happening in that large region on mining projects, and there's other countries where there's been things that have happened which are perhaps would be viewed by many as not being quite as progressive. And since you're going to have the floor in a moment, I'm curious to get your perspective on what does a mining company do in that kind of an environment when you actually have a government that is perhaps less concerned about Indigenous rights. It may seem, an odd question, but how do you act as a mining company that wants to do the right thing, but suddenly you've got perhaps much more latitude than you otherwise would? Just do what you want in a way. So over to you to maybe give us some perspective from your region.
Well, let me tell you that in our case, in Latin America, remember that the ILO or Convention 169 enacted or issued by the ILO in 1989 was ratified as an international treaty by several countries in Latin America in the 90s, in the beginning of this century, and actually in the case of Chile, it started, or it was ratified in 2008, and taking your point that what has happened, the last 10 years, actually in Chile, in 2014, there was a supreme decree issued by the government, ruling the procedures to have the Indigenous consultation. So in 2014, exactly 10 years ago, was enacted a rule whereby the mining companies, or wherever the companies are, have to go through the consultation process, and that is just a single point that you have to have in mind in order to figure out that there has been some rulings in this region, that has enacted or put in force, the ILO 169 convention, which is, a treaty which imposes the obligation of having consultation with the Indigenous communities. But more important than that, in my view, is that we were talking about the social license before, in terms of how are you successful with your project in the area that you want to build up this project. And I'm convinced that the companies, in general terms, are aware and fully convinced today that the only way to do it is to have this social license, which means, in some way, get, the areas, or to get the communities, either indigenous or not, supporters of your project. And therefore, today, I'm not answering your question, but I'm going to that, Peter. My only point is that in general terms, the companies today, I do not know a company as of today that does not have crystal clear what I'm saying in terms of the involvement with the people surrounding the project, either indigenous or not. So when you have a government which is not supportive of the indigenous consultation or whatever, actually, that the indigenous consultation is something that that the government has to do it, rather than the companies. But if you do not have a supportive government on that regard, I'm afraid that at the end of the day, if you are not convinced by yourself that you have to go through the entire process of consultation and the involvement with the indigenous communities, and to participate or to make participation with the indigenous communication to all the stuff that we were talking about before, I'm afraid that they will have, or that they probably will face very bad times here. And at that time, probably the government will not be supportive of the company, because what will happen is that probably at that stage, you will have to go to the courts to solve this stuff, and the rights and the law probably will not be supportive of the companies, unless they have this social license. In the past, just to give you an example, in the past, when even before that Chile subscribed the ILO 169, the courts started, saying, well, you have to consider the First Nations. And even, after signing the ILO 169, but before having this Supreme Decree which rules this stuff, the courts also were very active in protecting the indigenous rights, and also a trend that I have seen, is that if you want to have a finance, from any multilateral entity, or World Bank or whatever, or even with from international banks, and usually it's the kind of finance that you get for the mining projects. I'm afraid if you do not comply with certain, minimum, and the minimum is quite big, it's quite high, in terms of the relationship with the communities, you will not have the support of the banks. So either by virtue or by force, the companies has to face this stuff, I would prefer to have that by virtue, but anyway, that is the reality, and again, sometimes maybe with some governments, in general terms, I would say in Latin America, the governments are very supportive of the indigenous rights, but in some times, as you pointed out, in some places, I don't want to mention, maybe you don't have that support. But anyway, the company has learned the lesson, in my view, to accomplish with this stuff, rather than being superficial in that sense, or not aware of the importance of these social licenses in that sense.
What strikes me as I listen to both of you, is how similar the approach is, how similar you view the importance of this kind of engagement, despite the fact that the historical background may be different, the laws may be different. Obviously, there are international laws that have commonality, but it really is fascinating that we find ourselves at this point in time with a lot of similarities. Let me, with the few minutes we've got remaining before we wrap this up, let me ask each of you about where you think we're going. You know, I have a question from a member of the audience today who asks about added benefits of going further than the, basic legal duty to consult, and, the value brought to, mining companies for engaging with Indigenous communities. I think we've touched on that a little bit, but maybe turn it to you, Sheldon, first, and then I'll go to Rafael to see where do you think we're going? Where are we going to be in 10 years in your mind, so that, the audience and, those of us or those people who are in the audience who actually, are at mining companies, executives, sort of have some sense from both of you as to the direction that you feel this engagement, this type of engagement is heading.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I just give some thought back, and earlier, and I guess before my career kicked off, I had the pleasure and opportunity as well to travel to New Zealand and live there for 6 months and work with a Maori tribal council on a treaty land claim and redress. And just thinking about those consistencies, across the globe, and with respect to Rafael's comments and others that I've heard, over the course of my career, and where we've been and where we're going. And I think that we are on a journey, in moving to a more collaborative partnership approach and understanding, rather than a conquering approach, in terms of resource development and how do we get in as a company, and how do we do what we need to do to extract. And I think that these experiences that we've been through, as you mentioned, with respect to residential schools, and we've been through quite a number of things here within Canada, post treaty, Natural Resource Transfer Act, and those types of things that have occurred over time. And in 10 years from now, my hope and my belief is that we are going to be further down that line. We are going to have more First Nations, Indigenous people that have shared their experience, have built relationships, and have been and are respected, and are executives and have ownership stakes within companies. Many of our people over the course of the last 10, 20 years have been able to build a career in developing their own business with respect to many of these projects. And there's hundreds of millions and billions of dollars now that are being spent on Indigenous procurement. But I think getting to that next level where equity ownership will be common and it'll be the norm, I think that's extremely important. I also think, for those that are listening and on the webinar, I have a belief that within the United Nations world, and some are supportive, some maybe not, but I do think that the messaging and the work that is being done at the United Nations level, we see it, we see the benefits of it across the globe. And and just thinking of some of the sharings from Rafael and in your comments, Peter, we can all kind of look back. We're situated in different regions across the world, but we all hear what some of the work and outcomes at the UN level, sustainable development goals, these types of things. Those have far-reaching impacts, across the globe, which I think we gravitate to. And I'll continue to encourage that because the respect for inherent rights of First Nations or Indigenous people across the globe, it's a very important piece to ensure that we are continuing to move from that conquering mentality to a collaborative respect and partnership mentality. And I think that's a good way to go about things. So I'll leave my comments there, Peter, and I appreciate the question.
Rafael, we're just a little over time. Can you wrap us up in a minute or two?
Yeah, I do agree with Sheldon. I would say that today the relationship with the community, the Indigenous world or communities can be a contrast or opposite, and I think that the move is to go really to cooperative relationship, and I think that the communities also are knowing that that they want to be very, I would say, straight ahead with their views, and what I have seen, in the last few years is that they refuses, for example, to have people who is not really First Nation, and probably there will be, the next few years we will see, some learning of both sides, of how to deal with this and how to be collaborative. There will be some claims, there will be some fights, but anyway, it's part of the real life. But I am convinced that we are in the right path, in the sense that there is a mining industry which create value, which create opportunities, and at the same time we have these First Nations or Indigenous people who we have not only to respect but also to admire, to honor, and to put jointly the efforts in order to get a successful idea. And that is my view, is my opinion. Maybe too optimistic, but I'm optimistic. I'm somebody who likes the mine industry and really the opportunities that keep this mine industry.
Rafael, thank you for that. Thank you for ending us off on a positive note as well. That's always great. Very much appreciated. I very much appreciate your perspective and time. And Sheldon, to you as well, thank you so much for joining us. I found this very engaging. I found this to be a learning experience, and I hope the members of our audience did as well. I think there's something on our screen about a survey as well. Well, there's the QR code. Thank you to everyone. Hope you can join us for some of the other panels that we've got planned for you. And I wish you all a good rest of your day.